My name's Chip, and I'm the pastor here at Union Church, and I want to welcome you here. Whether this is your first time stumbling about this page on the internet, or if you're a long-time attender here at the church, you are welcome here. We are starting a new series today. This is a series I'm really excited about, and it's called Wisdom for Troubled Times. There is a lot going on in our world right now, and much of it is troubling. Whether it's the death of George Floyd, the continued spread of COVID-19, or the extreme economic hardship many of us are facing, these are troubling times. But God shines the light into the darkness. And in Ecclesiastes 7 verse 14, God tells us, when times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider. God has made the one as well as the other. As I have been trying to navigate so many changes in such a quick period of time, this has been the verse the Lord keeps speaking to me and to us as the church. When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider. When this situation first struck in mid-March, we all had a tendency to overwork. Like if we could somehow just keep treading, we'd stay above water. But that initial energy has given way to many more complex emotions: impatience, anger, fear, frustration, disbelief. And into all of that, God gives us this word: when times are bad, consider. Fools rush in. This isn't a time to just keep doing what we've always done, but this is a time, forced as it may be, for each of us as individuals and for us collectively to consider. Consider how we've been living our lives. Consider what changes we might need to make. Consider whether we've been valuing the right things and the right people. Consider what's much more complicated than we thought it was. This is time for us to stop and consider. We're going to be spending the next 3 months considering together the wisdom of God. In June, we'll be looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. In July, we'll be looking at Proverbs. And in August, we'll be looking at the book of Job. Today, God invites us into the book of Ecclesiastes to engage in God's wisdom as a place for believers to rest for a while and to soothe our weary hearts. Despite everything that's going on, God invites us into his counsel and his wisdom as a place to resist resignation and instead to find contentment. Specifically, the first 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes invite us to consider happiness. We normally look for happiness in wisdom or pleasure. First, we often seek for happiness through wisdom. Beginning to read from chapter 1, verse 12. I, the critic, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on human beings. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are a vapor, a chasing after the wind. These are the reflections of a hardened cultural critic. I think of someone today like David Brooks. The critic here has sought for happiness in studying and having all wisdom under heaven. But he's learned instead that having definitive knowledge is elusive. It's like chasing after smoke that's come out of a pipe or trying to catch your breath on a cold day. Vapor here in verse 12 is literally the word for breath. Some of your translations may say meaningless, but that's not really what he's saying here. It's not that there's no point to anything, but instead that finding the particular point in any circumstance in life is elusive. This is hard for us to hear because the critic is even a king. In verse 1, we learn the critic is a son of David, king of Jerusalem. And because of that verse, a lot of people think this literally means David's son, Solomon. But we know it can't be Solomon because in verse 16 of chapter 1 and in verses 7 and 9 of chapter 2, we learn there were many kings prior to this critic, and Solomon was David's son and the first heir of the king. And it's also depressing for us because this king would have had even better access to knowledge and wisdom than anyone else. But instead, despite all that access, he thinks everything is just vapor or just a breath. Today we might say, here today, gone tomorrow. Today, we often trick ourselves into thinking if we just had all the information at our disposal, then we would be happy. We aren't kings, but compared to when this was written, we sure live like them. We drink orange juice in the winter and, more importantly, have constant answers at the touch of our finger. I'm old enough to remember when we didn't know the lyrics of all our favorite songs, when we couldn't fact check our friends' claims about sports on our phones in real time. You would think this knowledge would make us happier, but it doesn't. We think knowledge can bring us happiness. I just recently did this when the pandemic hit. I started researching all the medical research of COVID directly, right off the Johns Hopkins site. I was reading the rates of infection and learning which surfaces maintain the virus and for how long. But then I started reading all the other research questions that were being researched, like, what if COVID is more like malaria than influenza and herd immunity doesn't work, but instead the more you encounter the virus, the more you're at risk? And what if the virus is mutating as it spreads? And what if it impacts the cardiovascular system as much as the respiratory system? And what if genetics is just as important as pre-existing conditions? And what if, well, you get the idea. And the conclusion I was forced to face is that I really don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not a doctor. And even scarier was realizing that no one knows the full picture. You devote yourself to study and to explore all wisdom under heaven. And instead, finding firm knowledge is like chasing after vapor in the air. Now, this isn't an excuse to be a simpleton or willfully ignorant. Ecclesiastes explains how far the critic went to pursue happiness through wisdom in verse 16. I thought to myself, look, I have grown in wisdom more than any who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much wisdom and knowledge. And then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this, too, is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. What God doesn't mean is that pursuing wisdom is bad. Like how learning as much as we can about a virus that's new is good. But that wisdom alone is insufficient or elusive for creating our happiness. To put this a different way, I know many very smart, very sad people. So the critic turns to pursuing happiness through pleasure, continuing to read at chapter 2, verse 1. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. but that also proved to be vapor. Laughter, I said, is foolish, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. The critic here is a kind of engineering mastermind creating entertainment for himself. He creates complex irrigation systems for beautiful plantations. He eats only the best food, listens to only the best music. If he was alive today, this guy would be sitting in Boston Public Garden, sipping Pinot as the Boston Pops serenaded him. Verse 10 tells us he denied himself nothing. He refused his heart no pleasure and took delight in the fruit of all his labor. And yet he's not happy. We trick ourselves into this all the time, don't we? Whether it's the infinite scroll on our phones when we're bored. If we just get to that next picture, no, the next one. No, the next one. Or maybe it's the binging of TV shows where we keep firing up that next episode. We're all, as Neil Postman once said, amusing ourselves to death. We distract ourselves with pleasure from work off to lights off. But we're not happy. And even worse, this constant pursuit of personal entertainment leads to injustice, to slavery, to wealth inequality, as verses 7, 8, and 9 tell us. Verse 11 goes on. When I surveyed all my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was vapor, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Then I turned my thought back to consider wisdom and also folly. I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. Even though wisdom is incomplete on its own, the critic decides it's preferable to just seeking constant pleasure for yourself. So where does that leave us? It leads us to that difficult truth that we can't control our own happiness. Distraction won't work, and neither, surprisingly, will hard-earned knowledge. But there is a lasting happiness that isn't vapor. Just last week, we celebrated Pentecost and God's gift of the Holy Spirit, which is a breath that doesn't blow away in the wind. While the meaning of life is elusive for us, it's not elusive for God, who brings contentment into our ignorance rather than just dreadful resignation. And the Holy Spirit is Christ's presence with us. Even in the midst of our pains and struggles to make sense of everything, Ecclesiastes is the book where God invites our skepticism into the life of faith. Just because you don't have the blueprints to your life doesn't mean there isn't a design for your life. Verse 16 tells us God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. The greatest encouragement wisdom offers, especially in these troubling times, is that our God, wisdom personified, has entered into the space of our unhappiness to provide us something lasting. Your trust in God will ebb and flow as your fortunes in this life rise and fall. But God has entered into the uncertainties of your life and become like you in order to show you even your unhappiness is not beyond the reach of God to redeem. For us as Christians, happiness is found in considering the grace of God, ultimately demonstrated by God dying for us on the cross. Happiness is found in considering this grace of God more than relying solely on our own strength or understanding. The Lord may give, the Lord may take, but happiness is found in blessing the name of the Lord through the good and the bad. Blessed be the name of the Lord.